All right, thank you for the introduction. As mentioned, my name is Michael Noel, and I'm a Microsoft MVP in SharePoint. I'm also the author of several books from Sam's Publishing, a lot of books in the Unleashed series, essentially. I've been working with a lot of our clients at a company called CCO, helping them move from on-premises to cloud environments for the past couple of years. And before that, I got a lot of work and exposure to the infrastructure side of Microsoft services.
And my name is Dan Holme. I'm the co-founder of IT Unity, and I've been a consultant for about 20 years, helping organizations in their Microsoft implementations, particularly in the IT organizations. But more recently, like Michael, have been spending a lot of time helping organizations strategize, align the roadmap of their business objectives with technologies, and architect solutions. I'm on MVP in Office 365, so Michael, with you being SharePoint and me being Office 365, I guess that makes us the perfect hybrid MVP.
That sounds good to me.
So as we're early in the new year, we're going to ask you to take a set of New Year's resolutions with us to improve information management, security, and compliance in your SharePoint and Office 365 environments. Resolution number 1 is to rethink the cloud and to ensure that you're fully informed about cloud security so that you can make intelligent decisions about your journey to the cloud based on your business requirements and the functionality and security features of the cloud. Michael, why don't you kick this one off and tell us what you see customers thinking about the cloud?
Many people look at the cloud environment and think to themselves, okay, that's not secure, everybody knows that when you put stuff out in the internet that it's at risk and that there's hackers and people that are going to come in and get at my data. And so what they do is they over the years, they've built firewalls around their organization. They've tried to essentially entrench themselves within their own organizations with large walls to try to keep people out. But you know what? The reality is that there's those giant walls that have been built up around these organizations are not quite as secure as people may think. Is that there really is no such thing as the inside and the outside anymore. You've got potential breach areas of exposure all around, within your organization, outside of your organization, and you need to kind of control all levels of that.
You're absolutely right. And when you think about the security disasters that grabbed the headlines in recent years, many, not all, but many, were really on-prem breaches. Even Snowden and Manning were actually on-prem security breaches. The loss of personally identifiable information at Target and Home Depot, the massive security incident at Sony, all of these were on-prem security breaches. And there really haven't been any security disasters from Microsoft's cloud so far, knock on wood. And I think that says something. People tend to underestimate the security of Microsoft's cloud and conversely overestimate their security on-prem. Both Michael and I agree that Microsoft's cloud in particular is especially secure. We had a long conversation during rehearsal about the components of Microsoft's cloud security, but unfortunately we just don't have time to talk about it during the live event because we want to make sure there's time for Q&A. I know it's a topic many of you will be interested in though, so I will put a link to the conversation along with the link to the recording of this webinar. So when the webinar is completed and the recording's posted, you will also be able to listen to that discussion Michael and I had about Microsoft Cloud security. Suffice it to say now that Microsoft's clouds are an incredibly secure platform and they have features that enable information management by the enterprise itself that would otherwise be very difficult for the enterprise to implement on-prem. And one of those features, Michael, I know you want to talk about right now.
One of the features that Microsoft has introduced within Office 365 is known as Azure Rights Management Services. And many of you may be familiar with the concept because it actually existed as a concept as a on-premises component in what was originally just called Rights Management Services and then later on became Active Directory Rights Management Services. Essentially, it's a form of information rights management that allows you to define what happens to the content after it's been accessed. So, one of the things that SharePoint's been very good about doing over the years is controlling who gets access to content. You set the permissions, you define that only this user that's been authenticated by this source can gain access to things, and that's worked very, very well, and it's been kind of been robust and built into the application. But what happens, after that user has the content, that's really where, the world's moving is trying to control that. It's essentially, that content getting outside of your organization is really what the industry refers to as data leakage. And, the whole field of data leak prevention, revolves around trying to make sure that information doesn't get out. And that's really what Azure Rights Management Services does. It's essentially a cloud-based version of the Active Directory Rights Management Services that then puts the encryption around the content. That the encryption can only be decrypted if the client agrees to a certain set of restrictions. Those restrictions do things like restrict the ability to copy and paste content, to be able to go through and print the content. So really, it's trying to avoid the kind of en masse release of data that we've seen in some of those high-profile leakage scenarios, like the Manning scenarios or the Snowden scenarios, where the person had rights to the content, they got the content, but then what they did afterwards wasn't the intent of the original owners of that content. Now, Azure Rights Management Services has the ability to do things like expire content after a certain amount of time, ensure that users are logging in each time they access the information. If you don't have that in place, incidentally, it does allow for offline access for a certain period of time. And what's interesting about this version, if you're familiar with some of the older versions that really just applied to Office documents, they now have the capability to do other file types, to encrypt them and to essentially put a wrapper around those file types that can only be opened if you have the proper credentials and if you've been authenticated properly with the rights management service itself. So that's an interesting concept that in addition to the Office documents which are supported, we now have the ability to do that for other file types as well too. So it's truly a kind of a really robust way of controlling that content and what happens to the content after the user has accessed it.
And Michael, I find it's really interesting that a couple of my clients have actually told me they're wanting to move their most sensitive data to the cloud. It's almost counterintuitive given the security and the cloud discussions that have been dominating the last couple of years. But what happens is these customers look at features like Azure Rights Management Services, and they see the level of control they can achieve, and they see how difficult it would be to implement on-prem. Then they look at the cloud and see that they can just get it out of the box with a subscription to Office 365.
And that's a really good point, is that when I think, as an infrastructure specialist over the years, how long it would actually take to set up all of the different components that are part of Office 365 versus, if I'm going to, have a client that gets a tenancy set up in Office 365 and that may take a couple of hours. It's a huge difference in what you can do. You have access to these tools like Azure Rights Management Services, which would have taken weeks to set up, if not longer, to set up all the database servers and the front end servers and to go through and set up SPNs in Active Directory. Well, you don't need to do that. You can essentially just turn it on and off you go, and you have the ability now to have that kind of control that you really didn't have before.
Yeah, I'm a huge believer in the value that Azure Rights Management Services contributes to the information management toolkit for IT pros in the Microsoft space. It's an amazing technology. And while the focus of this webinar is on security, we'd be remiss to point out that in the end, it's not just about security, it's really about business value. And in addition to security-focused capabilities like Azure Rights Management Services, when you get into Office 365, you suddenly have access to this enormously rich portfolio of Microsoft services, each of which address certain business scenarios better than many of the other services out there on the market, all as part of one integrated package. And this list is growing every day.
Exactly. As I was talking about, it's essentially, every couple weeks or so, Microsoft is releasing new features and new functionality within Office 365. And a lot of those features and functionality are not available within the on-premises versions of the software. There's no way that an on-premises infrastructure can maintain the level of pace in terms of versionings. So, you get all of that. You get all of these tools. You get everything within the same ecosystem, all very, very quickly and easily deployed.
Exactly. And not only are the technical barriers to entry very low, but the financial barriers to entry are low. Microsoft prices Office 365 extremely aggressively from a consumer standpoint. And also gives you a huge variety of plans that mix and match the features and services so that you can put together the plan that works and delivers the right value for your use cases. Now, it's important to realize that many of the more significant security features that we've been talking about are only part of the higher end plans. For example, archiving, DLP, and we were mentioning Azure Rights Management Services. Those are all part of the E3 and sometimes E4 plans of Office 365. But Microsoft is flexible enough in their packaging that you can mix and match plans for your workforce. If you're a manufacturing company, for example, you might not need DLP, archiving, and Azure Rights Management Services for your manufacturers on the factory floor. They can use kiosk accounts, and yet you can procure appropriate and fully functioning, fully rich accounts for your information workers in legal and finance, for example.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, I would say the majority of plans that I've seen are in the level of the E3 and then E4 because of that reason, right? You want to have access, to the DLP functionality and Azure Rights Management, those types of things. But like you said, not everybody is going to be in that same boat, or you may have a mix of users, and so you have a mix of K2 plans together with E3 plans at the same time.
And there's one plan we didn't mention. Let's call it the OS plan or the PC plan, Michael. That is, you have the option to stay on site in your private cloud. You don't have to go to Microsoft's cloud. And that's one thing that makes Microsoft's model particularly attractive, is that, to steal their term, you can have the cloud your way. You can mix and match on-prem and cloud services to meet your business needs. And Microsoft is committed to continuing to release on-site server versions of their service products, and in fact has committed very significantly to improve the support for hybrid scenarios in the upcoming version of on-premise SharePoint Server, which will be released later this year.
Correct. Yes. And really what Microsoft is doing is they're providing for these hybrid scenarios. The vast majority of our clients have some type of on-premises infrastructure that they need to come from and move, if they're moving to online versions. So what they do is they put in, hybrid functionality where some of their data is on premises and some of the data is up in the cloud. And what's really functional and what kind of distinguishes Microsoft from some of the other cloud offerings is that there's really very blurred lines in terms of administration between your on-premises and your cloud environment. So you can run, sequences of PowerShell scripts that apply to, objects both within cloud and within on-premises. You can manage and maintain them all through the same, what we call a pane of glass or the same administrative console. You have that flexibility to decide when and where you want to move your content. And as you mentioned earlier, Dan, it could come down to, your highly sensitive documents being up in the cloud, but then the majority of the documents that people work with being on premises, at least for the initial foray into Office 365. Or you could even reverse that and have team sites up in the cloud where a lot of new content is generated, and then if you're paranoid about security and you really want to keep it on premises, and you've ignored a lot of what we've said before this, you could have some of those secret documents stored on premises where you control. Ultimately, you are the only person that can crack them open. If the government comes to have some kind of audit request or what have you.
I think you painted the picture really well. It's about choice. Different organizations will approach their journey to the cloud for different reasons and at different paces. And as you look at your journey to the cloud with your organization, make sure that whatever you're choosing to put in the cloud, you're not doing just because the cloud is the newest technology and you've been sold a silver bullet or a glass of Kool-Aid. Make sure it's for business reasons. What you're putting in the cloud, the use case that you're supporting with cloud services, needs to either increase value or decrease risk. And in many cases, the kinds of workloads that organizations are looking at today will belong in the cloud. Security, as we've described, is generally not going to be the most salient concern. So why wouldn't you move to the cloud? Well, the first thing that comes to my mind are service level agreements, SLAs. Sometimes SLAs in the cloud are simply not going to be as rich as what you might be able to build on-prem. Now, I'm not talking specifically about uptime SLAs. Microsoft financially guarantees 3 nines, and it's been hitting closer to 4 nines of uptime. That's really hard to achieve on-prem. But there are other SLAs, things like how quickly can you restore data and to what level of granularity. Those kinds of service management and information management SLAs that you need to support specific business requirements might not yet be supported in the cloud. What other reasons, Michael, do you think might keep people from moving to the cloud?
Well, I think you're right. SLAs it drives some of that, but there's also, you may want to have very fast access to data. So a lot of times, a certain line of business application data that's constantly queried as part of a different application that may stay on premises. The nice thing, for example, SharePoint Online can integrate with that, can display information from internal line of business applications, within the sites that are part of SharePoint Online, but keeping that data internal. So there's some other technology reasons why. You have to consider the fact that you are moving from a model where all of your clients are making connections to internal infrastructure to a model in which they need to now go up to Eastern Washington or to Virginia or to wherever the data centers are, and that's introducing the potential for more increased latency, which not all applications support.
That's a great point, that sometimes access to the cloud is just too slow for a particular application. And I'd extend that and also say for users. I know, Michael, with as much travel as you and I do, we've been in places in the world where access to the cloud is simply too slow to be acceptable from a business performance and productivity standpoint. There are places where the cloud isn't accessible, where you're working disconnected altogether. So there are clearly scenarios where access to the cloud means that a specific use case simply can't be supported by the cloud. Michael and I both believe that the Microsoft clouds are far more secure than most organizations give it credit for, and far more secure than most on-prem environments can ever achieve. So stop using security as the scapegoat for why you're not moving to the cloud. That doesn't mean you should go running to the cloud, but instead you should be planning a journey to the cloud that is based on information, not hype, and based on your business needs. So resolve to spend time educating yourself and creating a roadmap that aligns your business requirements with both the security and business functionality of the cloud so that you can move forward in a reasonable manner, surviving for the foreseeable future in a hybrid world that balances out your needs for control with your business need for innovation. The pace of innovation in Office 365 is simply mind-boggling. It seems like every couple of days a new feature is released. And many times those features are explicitly security related, like Azure Rights Management Services or data loss prevention. But most of the time they're released as business value features, like external sharing, OneDrive for Business, and groups. It's important, however, that you recognize that every feature has the potential to impact your users, their use cases, the data they work with, and therefore the information management and security of your organization. So you must resolve to stay on top of feature releases as they're previewed in the Office 365 roadmap site, as they're announced on Microsoft's blogs, and as they roll out to the community. Stay on top and understand how these features affect your business. Let's take a look at these 3 features particularly and see how they relate to information security. External sharing was introduced in Office 365 a couple of years ago, so many of you will already be familiar with it. But if you're not, the name is pretty self-explanatory. It allows you to share a site or a document with a user outside your organization. Now, you can't share a library or a list quite yet, but you can share the entire site or an individual document. And you can share one of 2 ways, one that's more secure and one that's more user-friendly. The more secure option requires sign-in. The external user is required to sign in with their Microsoft account, which can be a personal account, Live, Hotmail, Outlook.com, or an organizational account, Office 365. Either way, they sign in using an account that you as an organization don't have to manage. That burden of identity management is offloaded to Microsoft's identity providers. The more user-friendly way to share is with what's called a guest link. A guest link generates a URL that contains the access token, so anyone with the link can access the resource. Now that's clearly more user-friendly. Click a link and the document is yours. But it's less secure, because if I share a document with you using a guest link, you could then turn around and forward that link to anyone or post it on a social media site, and the link would provide access. So you do have to spend some time thinking about how and where you will enable sharing with external users. And luckily, Microsoft gives you several controls that affect external sharing. At the tenancy level, you can configure sharing. In E-plans of Office 365, you can configure external sharing at the site collection level. And then at the site collection itself, you can enable sharing by all site members using the checkbox on the Access Reports settings page. And as long as you spend the time thoughtfully planning the use of external sharing, it's an excellent tool in building extranet collaboration scenarios with external vendors, customers, and partners.
And one thing I would like to add to that, Dan, too, is that over the years, one of my more popular sessions that I used to lead at different conferences was how to create extranets within a SharePoint environment. And from a security perspective, it was a highly complex thing that generally involved creating a SharePoint farm in a completely separate Active Directory forest within a DMZ environment, just to be able to securely share files with outside partners. Well, Office 365 takes away all of that pain of the infrastructure and security side of it, and gives the tools and gives the capabilities that people have been asking for over the years, and of course makes it much, much easier to deploy than if you had to create that entire set of infrastructure.
That's a great point, and I think these days most organizations are hesitant to punch holes through their firewalls at all, and identity teams are hesitant to add a bunch of external user accounts to their internal authentication providers like Active Directory. So that's a great point. And by the way, did we mention this is free? You can share with external users without having to pay license fees.
One of the things to point out, as we mentioned, Azure Rights Management Services, well, you can enable that, a certain level of that, to Microsoft accounts as well, too. So you can actually have them have to, prove that they own that email address and go through a process to, identify themselves as belonging to that domain, and then they can gain access to that document, and they're restricted what they can do with that information.
And one of the places from which you can share externally is your OneDrive for Business, which, as you probably know, is Microsoft's file, store, sync, and share capability within Office 365. Michael, why don't you fill us in and catch us up on OneDrive for Business?
Well, you may be familiar with the consumer-grade version of this, which is called OneDrive, previously named SkyDrive. Really, it's Microsoft's file sharing toolkit that allows you to share files, synchronize them between devices so that you can actually see them on your mobile devices and your laptops and in different locations. But really, this version of it is geared towards the businesses, and it's provided as part of an Office 365 subscription. Now, one of the things that really has to be noted is that OneDrive for Business is really effectively a SharePoint environment that has a different front end to it, and that has some synchronization components built into it. So it is running, essentially on a SharePoint backend. It's used, the files are stored, in a similar capacity, but all that is really obfuscated by Microsoft. You don't really see what's going on in the backend. You just see the fact that you can copy data, you can put it into different folders, you can share it with individual people, and not only that, you have a massive, size limit. So essentially, no size limits. So really, it's meant to be Microsoft's premier file share and synchronization tool.
Exactly, and I think it's important to remind people that OneDrive for Business as a concept also incorporates your team site document libraries. So that same store, sync, and share technology that applies in your personal OneDrive for Business also applies to all of your document libraries. And that makes OneDrive for Business really the ideal place to start consolidating documents that have been distributed across multiple services over the past 10 or 20 years. Pull together the documents that are in mapped drives and network shares, that are stored in inboxes and on local hard drives, that are stored on other cloud providers like Dropbox or Box, and put them into OneDrive, because then you empower those documents and those use cases with all of the amazing functionality of Office 365. Those documents are incorporated into Office Graph and exposed through Delve, for example. You also get, perhaps more importantly for this particular topic today, the security features of Office 365. You're able to now apply Azure Rights Management Services to those documents because they're now in Office 365. You have the ability to have the confidence that the underlying storage system is as secure as Office 365's Fort Knox. So you get the business functionality and the security functionality by moving documents into OneDrive for Business.
So one of the new features that got added into Office 365 after its initial release was this concept of what they call Office 365 groups. This is one of those features that just kind of got silently added in the background. Microsoft said a few things about it, but for the most part, it essentially just showed up, which is kind of one of the new paradigms of how being within a cloud environment like Office 365 works. Is you just suddenly start getting features thrown at you. Well, one of the interesting things about groups is that we're starting to see organizations use it as a replacement for the distribution list. So going back several decades, the standard way of communicating with a group of people was via an email distribution group. You added in users into that distribution group, and they received all of the emails that were sent to that particular group. So that worked fairly well for the most part. But one of the major disadvantages of that concept was that if you wanted to add someone to the group later on, they didn't receive all of the information from that, that was originally sent to the members of that group. So a lot of times what ended up happening is new members would get added into a team, into a distribution list, and they would have to catch up with where people are. And a lot of times it's resending data, resending information, resending old threads of information. So what Microsoft did in Office 365 is created this concept of a group, which is a much more intelligent organism that allows you, for example, to add in a user later on and then have them receive access to all of the information that was sent to that group. So they see all the email threads, they see all of the documents that were sent and the sharing information, and it does that through kind of marrying together the SharePoint and the Exchange sides of Office 365. So it really, it has the potential to greatly change the way that organizations do business. And it's just another one of those examples of the types of value add that you get by going into that Office 365 ecosystem.
But interestingly, I think groups also illustrate one of the dangers of being a cloud customer, and that is the pace of change is almost dictated by the service provider and can be faster than the organization is ready for. When Microsoft released groups, for example, it was on by default and open by default. So even in my own business, users went into Outlook, they saw the new groups feature, and they started creating groups before IT had really even had a chance to wrap their heads around the feature and to be ready to support them.
But we saw the same thing with groups. It was released onto users, and there really wasn't a lot of control around that, and people had to step back and then look at what's the best way to deploy this and to minimize some potential downside to creating these groups.
Absolutely, and I think that's why groups, perhaps more than any of the features we've discussed, really illustrates how important it is that you resolve to stay on top of changes to the feature set of SharePoint and Office 365, and how those changes impact your users, your business, your data, and your security. These features will generally be ones that can be controlled at some level, but it's not always going to be easy. So you're going to want to make sure you're equipped with procedures in your organization to manage change in configuration, with understanding of how to configure SharePoint and Office 365 in the user interface, with PowerShell scripts and skill sets to deploy configuration more easily, and with third-party tools that specialize in helping to ease the pain of managing a distributed environment like the Microsoft technology stack is now. The third and perhaps most challenging resolution is to get back to the basics and focus on information management, whether that information is on-prem or in the cloud. In my experience, customers suffer very fundamental weaknesses in their implementations of security essentials like data classification, role-based access control, and reporting and auditing. And yet they're being sold cloud services as a silver bullet that's going to solve all their problems, including perhaps problems with security. What do you think, Michael?
Well, the truth is that, all of these fancy cloud tools and great capabilities and the fact that it's much easier to deploy don't, mean that you don't have to put any thought into, some of the key pillars of dealing with data that were challenging enough, when it's on a file server and now are much more complicated with all these tools that are out there. And that includes things like, data classification, making sure what types of data are, is sensitive data versus what type of data is maybe not as sensitive or falls into different categories. Making sure that you give access to the data based on a person's role, a concept of role-based access control, which when implemented properly can greatly simplify and better secure an environment by allowing you to very easily just drop people into different roles and then have them have access to the data that they need to accomplish their role. And that's not necessarily going to be something that's going to be fixed just by going to Office 365. You still have to put the thought into how you access that and how you audit and report against the settings that are in your environment. So again, just going to cloud isn't the solution to everything. You still have to give a lot of thought to what you're doing with that data and how you control access and maintain and classify that data.
I couldn't agree with you more, Michael. In my opinion, these three pillars are data classification, that is identifying your sensitive data and defining security policies around it, managing access through role-based access control, and then keeping an eye on your environment with auditing and reporting are super critical, and they don't become any easier in the cloud. In fact, I think the pain an organization feels by not doing these things well on premise is only going to be logarithmically magnified as that organization moves into hybrid and cloud worlds. So this is a place where whether you're on-prem, whether you're hybrid, or whether you're the cloud, you've got to dedicate yourself to shoring up these fundamentals of security management and identifying the right collection of procedures, scripts, and tools to help you manage security effectively. And in my experience as a consultant, this is definitely a place where many customers turn to the broader SharePoint ecosystem, to third parties to help them address their security management needs.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. The vast majority of our clients, to satisfy the needs in this area, look at the third-party space to provide for better tools, because out of the box just really doesn't cut it. So, and that really leads to another area in which we see a lot of third-party tools be used, and that's really around migration. And that's distinctively the case for things like migration to SharePoint Online, because Microsoft doesn't even natively support a out-of-the-box option for migrating content from a SharePoint on-premises environment to SharePoint Online. You really have to look at the third-party space to be able to do that properly, or to be able to do that at all, unless you want to be literally pulling information out from one document library, dumping it onto one location, and then dumping it back up yourself using client-based tools. Obviously not a solution that you want to do for any type of large quantities of data. So migration to SharePoint Online is definitely one of the trickier aspects of going to a Office 365 environment.
I agree with you 100%. Migration is a great place to leverage third-party tools that know how to do what you're trying to do. And from a business perspective, migration is also the time to draw a line in the sand and say, we're going to do it right from here on out. We're going to focus on those pillars of security and on managing information more effectively so that we don't take our old habits and move them into a more complex world where they will create additional pain. So let's wrap up the resolutions we hope you take with us to improve information management, security, and compliance in your organization. First, rethink the cloud. Understand not just the business features and business drivers for the cloud, but also the significant security capabilities that can be introduced by moving to the cloud. Second, stay on top of new features as they're released so that you're ahead of their impact on your information management. And third, stay laser focused on the fundamentals of data classification, role-based access control, and auditing and reporting. And use your migration to the cloud as the time to start doing it right. And one way you can do it right is to recognize when out-of-box tools stop serving your needs and bring in help. quality third-party tools. As you know, this webinar has been brought to you by Metalogix, which has a suite of tools that address many of the pain points we addressed today. So I'd like to turn over the podium to our guests from Metalogix, who will fill you in on what their suite of tools can do to address your information management and security needs on-prem and increasingly in the cloud and in hybrid scenarios. If you've got questions or comments for any of us, please continue to use the Q&A panel and the chat panel. And as soon as Steve is finished, all of us will be here to answer your questions live. So let me hand the podium over to Steve.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Michael, as well for presenting. So as Dan said, my name is Steve Marsh. I am the Director of Product Marketing here at Metalogix. And just as a quick introduction to who we are and what we do, in case you don't know, haven't come across Metalogix before, we have a suite of tools that can help in a number of the areas that Dan and Michael were talking about. We're probably very well known for our SharePoint migration technologies, so moving from previous versions of SharePoint, various other content sources into SharePoint or SharePoint Online in Office 365. But we can also help in a number of areas covering SharePoint Exchange and Office 365, from backup, looking at the server health and diagnostics, through to email archiving and migration. But the area that I want to concentrate today is, keeping going with our security theme, is not so much on the individual platforms themselves. So not about Office 365 itself, as Dan and Michael mentioned, that it is inherently very secure as a platform. And that's something that, if you follow various surveys and reports that are about the cloud right now, such as one from KPMG recently, CIO's concern about the security and privacy of cloud platforms themselves is it's decreasing. They're becoming much more confident. Previously we were looking at in the high 80% range of concerns about the cloud, whereas now in this latest KPMG survey we're in the sort of 50s to low 60s range, depending on the question around cloud security. So we know that the physical security related to data center of Microsoft is very high, but what I want to think about is the content itself. How secure is your business critical content within the platform? And for that, I'm using this term, the insider threat, which is something that we've all seen, I'm sure, in the news, the impact of this. And Dan mentioned a couple earlier on in the session, such as Target, Home Depot, credit cards being stolen from a South Korea organization. As well as the Edward Snowden, and of course one of the most recent security breaches generally that we saw was around Sony. But particularly if we look at Target and Home Depot, these were very much a case of compromises from the inside. Now, they're not always insider threats or breaches, are not always malicious. In the case of Target and Home Depot, it was actually third-party contractors who were compromised when it came to the trigger for those breaches. And there really is a concern globally right now on the impact of these. The World Economic Forum in Davos last week, this was a hot topic of debate. Our CEO was actually presenting on this subject last week. And it really was a hot topic, and there was a report released that said the impact of these types of breaches could have a global impact of $2 trillion. That's a staggering number that we need to be thinking about. So, just what do we exactly mean by insider threats, and what are some of the things that we should be thinking about when it comes to mitigating against them, and what are our options, particularly when it comes to SharePoint and Office 365? Well, if you think about the security spending, or how you think about securing your information in your on-premises platform, or you think about how Microsoft are securing their platform, the majority of spending is on securing from external threats, stopping people getting into your network. But a recent survey showed that 67% of IT pros are concerned about these insider threats, not the external ones, but the majority of the spending is not set up to deal with them. Although insider threats are less frequent, the results are often more damaging, as we've just seen on the previous slide, the Home Depot, the Target breach, etc. So although the number are less frequent, we need to consider these because of the impact. So one of the things that I would strongly encourage you to do is think about, look at how you think about security right now, and potentially reevaluate where you're aligning your resources. As I said, it's not always about a malicious insider threat. We do have the case of the South Korea credit card company, for example, was a disgruntled employee who walked off with 20 million credit card accounts. But it's quite often accidental. We have credentials being compromised, old credentials from third-party contractors that we haven't thought about or haven't ended once the contract has ended. And as Dan mentioned, this is only going to get increasingly complex as we move towards the cloud. Not just the cloud itself, but also the ways that we access the cloud. We know that more and more people are using multiple devices to access content. And if you think of how we are set up to deal with this move to multi-device, multi-platform, cloud-based collaboration as well as on-premises, IDC estimates that by the end of this year, only 15% of large organizations are going to be equipped for this new wave of collaboration cross-platform, cross the cloud. But if we look at the number of insider threats that are happening right now, the majority are still happening within the office. So what should we be doing? What steps should we be doing to address some of these? Well, when it comes to SharePoint and Office 365, I think Dan said it very well earlier, that a lot of this comes back to ensuring that we're doing some of the basics correctly, around the areas of data classification, the role-based access, and then auditing and reporting on what's going on within our organization. So there's 5 areas that we commonly see within Metalogix come up time and time again when we are discussing this matter with our customers. And it comes down to making sure that we've got things such as having policies in place and educating our users on policies. We should be starting with non-technical elements. Why are we securing this content in a particular way? What's the business reason for doing it? How should we be doing this? Why, as a user, is this important that you work within these policies and procedures, and what it can mean for the individual personally and the company as a whole if we fail to do this? Looking at the permissions and access, looking at some of the best practices. I'll echo what both Michael and Dan said earlier around rights management and the new Azure, or relatively new Azure rights management from Microsoft. Rights management was I'd like to think of it as, it was a little bit of a pet technology of mine way back in my early Microsoft days. I saw this as, okay, in the early days there were some challenges around the implementation, but there really was, from the theory behind it, what this could bring to organizations, there really was some great great ideas and concepts behind the technology. But if we don't have our access and permissions organized and sorted out in the correct way, then it doesn't matter if we do implement something like Azure. We could have people who have moved jobs or left the organization, or a third-party contractor, the contract's ended, they're no longer working, but the credentials are still lying around. So we need to make sure that we are doing things such as implementing using least privilege principles. Only give people access, the level of access that they need to do their job. Don't start giving direct access within SharePoint and Office 365. And this is the thing that we see time and time again. People try and access a site, they request it, and the site owner just directly gives them permissions. Make sure that we are using groups in the right way to ensure that it's easy to manage and maintain the access to those sites and content. And once that user no longer needs access to the content, make sure that we revoke the permissions. Again, this is where the education definitely comes in, where something such as SharePoint, where the responsibility or control of elements of the security is passed on to the content owners and site owners. That's why it's so important to make education part of this. And one of the other areas that I see as very important, and actually is one of the areas where I think the majority of organizations are probably not where they should be, is regularly auditing the access. And again, this was something that Dan mentioned, the auditing and reporting. We need to know what is going on within our sites and content. Who is accessing specific content? How often are particular sites being accessed? Are we adhering to any, the governance and compliance policies that we laid out during step 1? It's very important that we do this. And I find that a lot of the times when it comes to accessing, auditing and reporting within SharePoint, a lot of organizations take a very reactive stance to this. It's when something happens or some other trigger event happens that they start to look at running the auditing features and delving into that information. And I think what we should be certainly considering is being much more proactive. So being alerted to what's going on within our sites so we can take action before it becomes a real problem. And that ties in nicely to the fourth area that I've got here, which is monitoring changes to security settings. So yes, SharePoint security requirements change over time. I often talk about SharePoint as being this living, breathing thing, so it has to be flexible and adapt to your business needs. But we need to make sure that our security changes are aligned with those business needs and requirements to access the content. So this is definitely where the being proactive and monitoring these things come in. So we need to be able to get the information and have a plan on how we can stay on top of those changes. And in some instances, it's possible that we can actually automatically prevent some of these settings being changed. And I mentioned it a couple of times that often the end users are the ones that are the site content owners, for example. They are the ones that have responsibility for giving permissions and applying permissions and allowing people access to content. To make sure that we are educating users with the right tools and permissions to do their job, make sure that they have the right information at hand. And that's where a product like our Metalogics control point comes in. Can definitely fill the gaps, some of the gaps that the out-of-the-box tools have. Whether it's looking at the permissions across your sites or different farms, but also this idea of being much more proactive rather than reactive. So we can start to look at auditing and reporting automatically on what's going on what's going on within your organization. We can help end users by automatically putting controls in place to provision sites in the right way with the right settings when it comes to security right from day one. And there really is a whole range of capabilities that apply not just to SharePoint as an ongoing concern, but as we get ready to move to the cloud. Control Point is great for helping us understand what we currently have within our implementation. So we can start to figure out what content we should move to the cloud, what content we perhaps should not. Do we have any best practices around usage of SharePoint or security implementations within SharePoint that we can make use of as we move to the cloud? So it isn't, as I mentioned, just about the ongoing security and compliance and administration. There are a whole range of capabilities with Control Point that can help you plan and map out your move to the cloud when you're ready to do that. And it really is about, just to tie it into those top 5 security essentials. You can think about revoking the permissions. I mentioned this, make sure that we're giving with least privilege and then revoke those permissions when the user no longer needs access to it. Make sure that we're keeping on top of who has access to what particular sites and content. Be proactive. Monitor what people are doing. Get alerts for what's going on. And as I mentioned, this provides tools to prevent certain things happening. So we can start to think about creating sites in the right way, or if people start to make changes to our security, we can actually prevent them and roll them back if they don't align with the policies that we have. And I've used this term a few times about being proactive. I think this is definitely what we should be doing. 2014 was dubbed the year of the security breach. And I've already heard a lot of reports in the press talking about, well, actually, 2015 will be the year of the security breach. Kind of a scary thought given the high-profile breaches we had last year. So this really should be the time where we start to think about being much more proactive, mitigate against some of these risks, the Snowden-like effect, if you like. So looking at some of these internal threats on making sure that you're not the next organization to hit the headlines. So just tying this into some of the moving to the cloud that we've talked about earlier, there's a couple of points that I just want to make and re-emphasize on some of the things that Dan and Michael said earlier, and particularly when it comes to hybrid. One of the things that I would say is make sure that we're talking the same language. Dan mentioned earlier that Microsoft talk about the cloud your way. Well, make sure that we are Microsoft's definition of hybrid and our definition of hybrid are the same things. On-premises and Office 365, a mixture of those, are very different from an on-premises deployment of SharePoint and putting something in a private cloud. And that private cloud, in essence, could be something that's running in Azure or other infrastructure as a service. And there's different capabilities that we get with those, and it also has an impact on the tools and the use cases and what we can do from a security perspective. So make sure that you do have a common language there. There's some health warnings I put around this, that when we do move into the hybrid environment, yes, it's great for meeting the various business needs that you have, but we do need to bear in mind that we have a potential to duplication of some of these things that we've been talking about, from managing the security and permissions, getting the views into usage and auditing across them. And a few of the other things that the guys also mentioned, for example, the rate of a change in Office 365, that has an impact. So we need to consider that. Change management for our users, additional education that we may have to do as we change. And one of the things that we are seeing and hearing from customers is often that if you do not have your house in order on premises right now, if you aren't using or don't have the tools in place, these sorts of weaknesses will be magnified as we move to a hybrid environment, as we move to the cloud. So just be aware of that. We've all mentioned keeping on top of the roadmap. I thought I'd just throw in a quick slide here with a link to the Office roadmap. So if you're not familiar with this site, I'd highly recommend you go there, make it a regular site that you visit to see what Microsoft are planning for Office 365, what's been rolled out, what is currently being rolled out. Really is a wealth of information. And just before we wrap up and move to the Q&A, I just want to provide some closing thoughts on this and summarize what I've said earlier. Make sure that we do understand the differences between on-premises, hybrid, and Office 365 when it comes to the capabilities, and also what that means from a security perspective. Reevaluate how you look at security. So look at the risks as the landscape around collaboration changes, as we start to embrace the cloud. So just consider what we have or how we are looking at security today, and think about what we need to be looking at as we move forward. Make sure that we do have sensible governance policies in place, such as the separation of duties. If you think about it, quite often right now, I bet there's a few of you out there that have farm administrator credentials and then are also have access to all the site collections as well. That's maybe something we should think about, the separation between the underlying infrastructure for managing on-premises and the content itself. If you think about that in a business process context, quite often we would not be having the same person create purchase orders and approve them. So why do the same for IT? And a few other areas around sensibly embracing the cloud. So understand what we currently have, make sure we're moving the right content to the cloud. And I've mentioned it a couple of times before around the end user education. Really need to make sure that people understand why we have these policies in place and what this means. For example, there was a survey by, I think it was AIM, that said 76% of users think it's perfectly acceptable to take business content and move it onto their personal devices. Now, in a lot of cases, that might be okay, but if not, we want to make sure users understand why that is not going to be okay, and then make sure we have the tools, etc., in place, such as Control Point, if that's right for you, and some of the other tools that Metalogics offer, to ensure that you can meet this changing collaboration platform. So with that, I'm going to hand back to Dan.
Wonderful. Thank you so much,